Sometimes the best revenge is served cold, calculated, and with a side of financial devastation. They thought they could screw me over and I'd just take it lying down. They were wrong, dead wrong. My name is Madison Cross, and I used to be the golden child of Pinnacle Dynamics Corporation. Used to be. Until they decided to teach me a lesson about knowing my place. Little did they know, I was about to teach them one about underestimating the wrong person. It started on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember because it was the day everything changed. I'd been working at Pinnacle for 7 years, climbing my way up from junior analyst to senior director of strategic partnerships. I was good at my job. Scratch that. I was exceptional. I had a track record that spoke for itself. 3 major client acquisitions worth over $40 million in annual revenue, 2 industry awards, and a reputation that opened doors across the corporate landscape. But apparently, none of that mattered when the new management decided they needed to restructure compensation packages to align with market standards. Translation: they wanted to cut costs and figured they could get away with screwing over their top performers. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. I walked into the conference room on the 15th floor, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor with the confidence of someone who'd earned every step up that corporate ladder. The room smelled like expensive leather and bad decisions, fitting, considering what was about to unfold. Marcus Whitfield, our newly appointed CFO, sat at the head of the table with his perfectly pressed suit and his Harvard MBA smugness. Beside him was Janet Morrison, the head of HR, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. And then there was David Chen. Wait, no, David Park, the CEO who'd been brought in 6 months ago to shake things up. "Madison, please have a seat," David said, gesturing to the chair across from them. The setup felt like an interrogation, which should have been my first red flag. I sat down, placing my portfolio on the table with the same precision I brought to every aspect of my work. "Good morning. I assume this is about the Henderson Industries contract? I've got the final numbers ready for review." Marcus cleared his throat and exchanged a look with Janet. "Actually, Madison, we're here to discuss your compensation package." My stomach dropped, but I kept my expression neutral. In corporate America, you learn to read the room quickly, and this room was screaming bad news. "Your current bonus structure," Marcus continued, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through what I assumed were my performance metrics, "is, well, it's no longer sustainable given our current financial projections." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, could you be more specific? My bonus structure is directly tied to my performance metrics, which have consistently exceeded targets for the past 3 years." Janet leaned forward, her voice taking on that fake sympathetic tone that HR people perfect in their sleep. "Madison, we appreciate everything you've done for the company. You've been a valuable asset, but we need to make some adjustments to ensure long-term sustainability." "Adjustments," I repeated slowly. "What kind of adjustments?" David finally spoke up, and I could hear the practiced corporate speak in his voice. "We're reducing your performance bonus from its current structure to a more modest, fixed amount. This will help us maintain consistency across all departments." The numbers that came next hit me like a freight train. My annual bonus, which had averaged around $180,000 over the past 3 years based on my performance, was being cut to $18,000. A flat $18,000, regardless of how many million-dollar contracts I brought in. I stared at them for a long moment, processing the sheer audacity of what they'd just proposed. "You're cutting my bonus by 90%. "It's not a cut," Marcus said quickly. "It's a restructure. Everyone's compensation is being reevaluated." "Everyone's?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The slight pause before Janet's response told me everything I needed to know. "We're starting with senior-level positions and working our way down." Translation: they were starting with me because they thought I wouldn't fight back. They thought wrong. I stood up slowly, gathering my portfolio with deliberate calm. "I see. Well, I'll need some time to review this proposal and discuss it with my attorney." David's expression shifted slightly. "Madison, let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. This is a standard business decision. Of course it is, I said, smiling the same smile I used when closing difficult deals. I'll get back to you within 48 hours. I walked out of that conference room with my head held high. But inside, I was seething. They'd just cut my compensation by over $160,000 annually. And they expected me to smile and say thank you. They'd made a critical error in judgment, though. They thought they were dealing with someone who would just take it and move on. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. The next 48 hours were a blur of phone calls, research, and very careful planning. I called my attorney first, a sharp woman named Patricia Hughes who specialized in employment law. She confirmed what I already suspected, legally. They could restructure my compensation as long as they followed proper procedures and gave adequate notice. But legal and smart were two very different things. I spent the next day digging through my files, reviewing contracts, and making a list of every major client relationship I'd built over the past 7 years. The picture that emerged was both depressing and empowering. Depressing because it showed just how much value I'd brought to Pinnacle. Empowering because it showed just how much they stood to lose. My client portfolio was worth approximately $47 million in annual recurring revenue. I had direct relationships with 12 major accounts, and I was the primary point of contact for another 8. More importantly, I had been the one to negotiate the exclusivity clauses in most of these contracts. But the real kicker was the Henderson Industries deal I'd been working on for the past 8 months. It was worth $25 million over 3 years, and I was exactly 72 hours away from closing it. The contract was structured as a partnership agreement between Henderson and Pinnacle, with specific performance guarantees and penalty clauses. I'd built my entire career on attention to detail, and that attention to detail was about to pay off in ways Marcus and David never saw coming. On Thursday morning, I walked back into that same conference room, but this time, I was the one in control. I'd traded my usual business attire for my most expensive suit, a sharp navy blue Armani that made me feel like I could conquer the world. I was about to try. "Madison," David said as I entered. "We're glad you're here. Have you had a chance to review our proposal?" I sat down and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. "I have, and I've prepared my response." Marcus leaned forward eagerly, probably expecting me to negotiate for a slightly better deal. Instead, I slid the paper across the table. "What's this?" Janet asked, picking up the document. "My resignation letter," I said calmly. "Effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear the wheels turning in their heads as they tried to process what I'd just done. David was the first to recover. "Madison, let's not be hasty. If you're unhappy with the compensation adjustment, we can discuss alternatives." "There's nothing to discuss," I replied, standing up. "You've made it clear that my contributions aren't valued at their actual worth. I've decided to take my talents elsewhere." "But the Henderson deal," Marcus started. "What about it?" I asked innocently. "You're in the middle of closing a $25 million contract," David said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. I smiled. Was in the middle. As of today, I'm no longer employed by Pinnacle Dynamics, which means I'm no longer authorized to negotiate on behalf of the company. The full implications of what I'd just done began to sink in. I could see it in their faces, the dawning realization that they'd just lost their most valuable client relationship manager 3 days before the biggest deal of the quarter. "Madison," Janet said, her HR training kicking in, "surely we can work something out. Maybe we were too hasty with the compensation restructure." "Maybe you were," I agreed. "But it's too late now. I've already accepted a position elsewhere." That was a lie, but they didn't need to know that. Yet, I left them sitting in that conference room, probably scrambling to figure out how to salvage the Henderson deal without me. But I wasn't done, not even close. The next phase of my plan required perfect timing and a little bit of corporate espionage, nothing illegal. Just information that was technically available to anyone who knew where to look. You see, when you spend 7 years building client relationships, you learn a lot about how business really works. You learn that loyalty is a two-way street. and that companies who treat their employees poorly usually treat their clients the same way. More importantly, you learn that information is power. And I had been collecting information for years. My first stop was a coffee shop 3 blocks from Pinnacle's headquarters, where I'd arranged to meet with Robert Henderson, the CEO of Henderson Industries. Robert and I had developed a solid working relationship over the past 8 months, and I knew he trusted my judgment. "Madison," Robert said as I joined him at a corner table, "I have to admit, I was surprised by your call. Everything okay?" I stirred my coffee slowly, choosing my words carefully. "Robert, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. How important is personal accountability to you in business relationships?" He raised an eyebrow. "Very important. Why?" "Because I'm no longer with Pinnacle Dynamics as of yesterday. And I wanted you to hear it from me before someone else tried to spin the story." Robert's expression grew serious. "What happened?" I told him the truth. About the compensation cut, about the way management had handled the situation, and about my decision to leave. I was careful not to disparage Pinnacle directly, but I didn't need to. Robert was smart enough to read between the lines. "So who's going to be handling our account now?" he asked. "I honestly don't know," I replied. "But I wanted to make sure you had my personal contact information in case you needed anything during the transition." Robert nodded slowly. "I appreciate that, Madison. You've been straight with us from day one, and that means something." We finished our coffee, and I left feeling like I'd planted the right seeds. But I wasn't done planting. Over the next 3 days, I had similar conversations with 8 other key clients. I wasn't actively trying to poach business. That would have been unethical and potentially illegal. But I was making sure they knew I was available if they needed anything. And I was letting them draw their own conclusions about what my departure meant for their relationships with Pinnacle. The results were faster and more dramatic than I'd anticipated. On Monday morning, exactly 1 week after that fateful meeting, I got a call from Patricia, my attorney. She was laughing when I answered. "Madison, you need to see this. I just got a call from Janet Morrison at Pinnacle. Apparently, they're having some client retention issues." "Oh," I said, trying to sound surprised. "Henderson Industries terminated their contract this morning, cited concerns about continuity of service and changes in account management. They're also demanding return of their initial project fee." My heart started racing, but I kept my voice steady. "That's unfortunate. It gets better," Patricia continued. 3 other clients have put their contracts under review, and 2 more have requested immediate meetings with senior management to discuss recent changes in the partnership. I did some quick math in my head. If Henderson pulled out completely, that was $25 million gone. If the other clients followed suit, Pinnacle was looking at losing over $40 million in annual revenue in 1 week. But I still wasn't done. That afternoon, I got a call from David Park. His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Madison, we need to talk." "I'm sorry, David, but I don't think that's appropriate. I'm no longer employed by Pinnacle." "This is about the Henderson contract," he said. "They're claiming breach of contract because you're no longer available to manage their account." I paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I'm sorry to hear that, but as you pointed out last week, this is a standard business decision." "Madison, please. We both know this is about more than just the Henderson contract. If you come back, we can discuss reinstating your original compensation package." "My original compensation package?" I repeated. "You mean the one that was no longer sustainable given your current financial projections?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Look," David finally said, "maybe we made a mistake. Can we meet to discuss this?" "I'm afraid I'm no longer available for meetings," I said pleasantly. "I've accepted a position with another firm." That was still a lie, but it was about to become the truth. You see, while Pinnacle was hemorrhaging clients and scrambling to figure out damage control, I'd been busy having conversations with their biggest competitor, Meridian Strategic Solutions. Meridian had been trying to poach me for 2 years, and I'd always turned them down out of loyalty to Pinnacle. Loyalty, as it turned out, was a one-way street. My meeting with Meridian's CEO, Catherine Walsh, was scheduled for the following Thursday. By then, the full scope of Pinnacle's losses had become clear. Henderson Industries had not only terminated their contract, but had also filed a formal complaint with the Industry Regulatory Board, citing unprofessional handling of client relationships and failure to maintain promised service levels. The complaint was public record, which meant every potential client in the industry could read about Pinnacle's problems. In the corporate world, perception is reality, and Pinnacle's perception was rapidly deteriorating. Catherine offered me a position as Vice President of Client Relations, with a base salary that was 40% higher than what I'd been making at Pinnacle, plus a performance bonus structure that would have made my old compensation look modest by comparison. But the real kicker was the signing bonus, $200,000 paid immediately upon signing the contract. I signed on the spot. The next morning, I sent a brief email to my former colleagues at Pinnacle, informing them of my new position and thanking them for the opportunities I'd had there. I made sure to copy Marcus, David, and Janet on the email. Within an hour, my phone was ringing. Madison, Marcus's voice was strained. We need to discuss a counteroffer. A counteroffer? I laughed. Marcus, you had your chance to value my contributions appropriately. You chose to cut my compensation by 90% instead. That was a mistake, he admitted. We're prepared to offer you a senior vice president position with a significant salary increase. How significant? I asked, curious to see how desperate they'd become. $200,000 base, plus your original bonus structure, plus equity options. I did the math quickly. They were offering me nearly double what I'd been making before the compensation cut. A week ago, I would have been thrilled with that offer. Now, it felt like too little. Too late. I appreciate the offer, Marcus, but I'm happy with my new position. Madison, please. We're losing clients because of your departure. Henderson was just the beginning. We're facing potential losses of over $30 million. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I didn't take pleasure in seeing people lose their jobs. But I wasn't going to sacrifice my career to save a company that had been willing to sacrifice me. Think about your former colleagues. Marcus continued. If we lose these contracts, we'll have to lay off staff. That was a low blow, and we both knew it. But it was also revealing. They were willing to use emotional manipulation to get me back, which told me they were more desperate than I'd realized. Marcus, I said carefully. If you're genuinely concerned about your staff, maybe you should reconsider the compensation restructure you're planning to implement across the company. Treating your employees well is usually the first step in retaining clients. I hung up before he could respond. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. At Meridian, I was given resources and support that I'd never had at Pinnacle. My new team was motivated, well compensated, and eager to prove themselves. Within a month, I'd closed 2 major deals that brought in over $15 million in new business. Meanwhile, Pinnacle's situation continued to deteriorate. The Henderson contract termination had triggered a clause in their insurance policy that required them to pay substantial penalties. 3 other major clients had followed Henderson's lead and terminated their contracts. The company was facing a total loss of over $35 million in annual revenue. But the real damage was to their reputation. Word had spread throughout the industry about their treatment of employees and their inability to maintain client relationships. Potential clients were choosing competitors, and their existing clients were nervous about the company's stability. 6 months after my resignation, I read in the business section of the newspaper that Pinnacle Dynamics had been acquired by a larger firm for significantly less than their market value the previous year. David Park had been let go as part of the acquisition, along with Marcus and most of the senior management team. Janet Morrison had survived the acquisition, but she'd been demoted to a junior HR role. I felt a brief moment of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the knowledge that dozens of innocent employees had lost their jobs because of their leadership's poor decisions. The administrative assistants, the junior analysts, the support staff, they'd all paid the price for management's arrogance. That's the thing about corporate revenge. It's never just about the people who wronged you. There's always collateral damage, and you have to be willing to live with that. A year later, I was promoted to senior vice president at Meridian, with a compensation package that was nearly triple what I'd been making at Pinnacle before the cuts. I'd also been headhunted by 2 other firms, which gave me significant leverage in negotiations. But more importantly, I'd learned a valuable lesson about knowing my worth and not accepting less than what I deserved. The corporate world is ruthless, and if you don't stand up for yourself, no one else will. I'd also learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting back at people who wronged you. Sometimes it's about succeeding so spectacularly that their poor judgment becomes impossible to ignore. The final twist in this story came 2 years after my departure from Pinnacle. I was at an industry conference, networking with potential clients, when I ran into Marcus Whitfield. He was working for a mid-sized consulting firm, having taken a significant step down from his CFO position. "Madison," he said, approaching me with a hesitant smile. "Congratulations on your success at Meridian. I've been following your career." "Thank you," I replied politely. "I wanted to apologize," he continued, "for how things ended at Pinnacle. We made some poor decisions regarding your compensation." I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse. What I saw was a man who'd learned a hard lesson about the cost of undervaluing talent. "I appreciate the apology, Marcus," I said, "but I think things worked out for the best." He nodded slowly. "They did for you. The acquisition was difficult. A lot of good people lost their jobs." "That's unfortunate," I said, and I meant it. "But those decisions were made by leadership, not by me." "I know," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know that we recognized our mistake. Too late, but we recognized it." As I watched him walk away, I felt a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction at being vindicated, sadness for the collateral damage, and a strange sense of closure. The truth is, I never set out to destroy Pinnacle dynamics. I simply refused to accept being devalued and made a decision that was in my best interests. The fact that this decision had catastrophic consequences for my former employer was their fault, not mine. They'd made a critical error in judgment. They'd assumed I was replaceable. They'd calculated that they could cut my compensation by 90%, and I'd just accept it because I needed the job more than they needed me. They were wrong on both counts. In the corporate world, your value is determined by what you bring to the table and how difficult you are to replace. I brought significant value: $47 million in annual client relationships, a track record of success, and industry expertise that took years to develop. And I was irreplaceable in the minds of my clients, who trusted me personally, not just the company I worked for. When Pinnacle's leadership failed to recognize this, they made it easy for me to take my talents elsewhere. The fact that my departure triggered a domino effect that cost them tens of millions of dollars was a natural consequence of their poor decision-making. The lesson here isn't about revenge, it's about knowing your worth and not accepting less than what you deserve. It's about building relationships based on trust and mutual respect, not just corporate hierarchy. And it's about understanding that in today's business environment, talent is mobile, and loyalty must be earned, not demanded. 3 years later, I'm still at Meridian, now as executive vice president with a compensation package that would make my former Pinnacle salary look like pocket change. I have a team of 12 people working under me, and we're consistently the top-performing division in the company. More importantly, I've made sure that my team members are fairly compensated and treated with respect. I've learned from Pinnacle's mistakes, and I'm determined not to repeat them. Sometimes people ask me if I regret leaving Pinnacle the way I did. If I feel bad about the consequences of my departure, the answer is complicated. I regret that innocent people lost their jobs because of their leadership's poor decisions. I regret that a company with a lot of potential was destroyed by arrogance and short-sighted thinking, but I don't regret standing up for myself and refusing to accept less than what I was worth. In the end, they thought they were teaching me a lesson about knowing my place. Instead, they learned a lesson about the true cost of undervaluing talent, and that lesson cost them $25 million overnight. a price that was far higher than the $160,000 they thought they were saving by cutting my bonus. As I tell my team members now, your career is your responsibility. No one else is going to look out for your interests, so you have to be willing to look out for yourself. Know your worth, document your achievements, and never accept less than what you deserve. Because sometimes, the best revenge is simply being irreplaceable. And sometimes, when companies forget that lesson, they pay a price that makes your original worth look like a bargain. That's the story of how I cost Pinnacle Dynamics $25 million overnight, not through sabotage or corporate espionage, but simply by refusing to accept being undervalued and taking my talents to a company that appreciated what I brought to the table. They cut my bonus by 90%. I cost them their future. Fair trade,